thank you so much for joining us on this very happy time in our new, spanking new building. Let me introduce myself. I'm Roberto Fernandez. I am a relative puppy compared to some of the people in this room and their involvement with MIT. I'm only here 11 years. And I am the interim director of the PhD program right now. Interim because Ezra Zuckerman, who is the current director, is on sabbatical and he's in Israel. Frankly, if we were having the festivities on a Saturday, I'd be standing in for him anyway, so don't feel too bad, okay? I'm the lucky 14th, I guess. We've gotten off the 13th, so I'm interim 14th director of the PhD program. That's how long we've been running. What I would like to do is first acknowledge the very hard work that Sharon Cayley, who, please, we would not be here without Sharon's hard work. And where is Sharon? Sharon learned that I was going to embarrass her, I guess. She'll come back. The other thing I would like to do, these are happy times, welcoming you back. What I'd like to do is to just ask you to say a word, who you are, name, rank, and serial number, right? Who you are, what did you graduate in, what year, and say hello to your colleagues. And if we could just go around the room, I think that would be a great way to welcome everyone back to these festivities. Can I start with you, please?
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place among PhD people. I was just a Sloan Fellow in 1990. I've been with the same organization for 35 years, the United Bible Societies, 145 different countries. I'm like a UN staffer. We're vertically upside down.
Thank you. Well, welcome, please.
My name is Usman Ghani. I do not have a PhD, but I have master's program from MIT here, Sloan School, the other building. And I'm currently in Dallas doing my own work, and also an adjunct professor at UTD, which is in Richardson, Texas.
My name is Yoshihito Takahashi. I'm an alumni, graduated from MOT program 2000. After 5 years from graduation, I enter a university as a assistant professor. Associate professor. So now I have a PhD in Japan. So I am very interested in this program now.
Thank you very much.
I'm Mahin Dekoda. I'm mother's alumni's mother, retired, and interested in PhD programs. Thank you.
Hi, Tahir Dakota, class of 2001, MBA program. And I've always told my mom if I came back for school, it would definitely be to consider for the PhD program here.
You know that it's repeat business is always the main measure of the success of a program, so welcome.
Hello, I'm Steph Oba. I am a graduate of MBA 2006, and I'm very happy to be back here and seeing some of my professors.
Hi, I'm Felipe Negrão, class of 2006 MBA program. I also had class with many of you, and glad to be here.
Hi, my name is Henrique Rutter, MBA 2007, and very glad to be here too.
Hi, I'm Jim Utterback from the class of 1969.
New faculty. Hi, I'm Marcus, MBA class of 2001, and afterwards went back in Germany, got a PhD as well. Now work for State Street, Global Advisors, and part-time as a guest lecturer at a German university, and here together with my wife, Daisy.
Welcome.
Thank you. John Sturman, PhD alum from 1981 and faculty member.
Okay, thanks. Let's go this way. We'll keep going.
Hi, my name is Parasa. I'm a fellow graduating 2012.
Okay, thank you. Al?
Hi, I'm Hiram Samuel. I'm a Sloan Fellow from 2006, and I'm actually a fourth-year PhD student now in the IRA group.
So in-process inventory.
Don Lassard, faculty member since 1973, and have been engaged with a number of our PhD students.
We were counting, actually, and his score is pretty good. It's 13, I think, when you add in the other ones, right? Thank you. Please.
Thank Thank you. Esmeralda Migueli, class of 2006 MBA, and now working for a venture capital firm and writing a book on private equity.
Welcome back. Thank you. Joanne, you should say hello too.
Joanne Yates, not an alum at all. I'm on the faculty, teach communication, and I am currently in the Dean's office as the Deputy Dean.
Thank you. We're really grateful to those who serve.
Hi, I'm Chuck Baumlin. I'm here with my wife, Iris, Sloan Fellow, 09.
Iris Bomblin, SF09. Currently, I'm the Vice President of Manufacturing at Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company.
Hi, Gordon Kaufman, faculty, only been here a short time, 48 and a half years.
Hi, I'm Nitin Jalgalkar, a PhD, alum, class of 97, and I'm at Boston University on the faculty there.
Welcome.
I'm Jim Stoner. I joined the in 1959 I came to MIT and joined the MBA type program at that time. I went to Africa, the Fellows in Africa program. I actually got a fellowship for my PhD. Held that off for a while. I went to Carol Wilson's Fellows in Africa program, came back, got my PhD here in '67, and I think I may be in the first PhD class in some sense. When did the PhD program start? Started 60, and I was here in 60, and I had my PhD fellowship in 60. So I'm in the first class of PhD folks. My field was international business. I wrote my master's and doctoral theses in social psychology, and since then I've taught just about everything everywhere around the world, it seems sometimes. And my wife has a PhD from MIT. Oh, I was the last one.
No, but not least.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Brodsky, PhD 91 in healthcare management and management information systems. I'm currently working at the federal part of Ingenix, a large health IT company that does all sorts of kinds of data analytics about both money and clinical stuff in health, where I am attempting to figure out how the over 2,000-page Health Reform Act is going to affect our products.
Thank you. So I see Sharon's back in the room. Okay. Just to remind people who you are, we can't do this without Sharon. You got a round of applause, but you were outside the room.
Sorry.
We're going to do it.
Thank you very much. I'm Sharon Cayley, and I've been running the doctoral program behind the scenes for 30-some years. When I came to MIT initially, I was only going to be here 1 year, and as you've probably experienced yourself, when you come to MIT, it's increasingly hard to leave. It's never been dull, never boring, always changing, keeps your brain sharp, and thank you very much for your interest in the program.
Would you like to introduce yourself? You were out of the room as well. I spy a new person. Yes.
I'm sorry about that. I'm Lucia Brower, MBA 2002, and from Venezuela. After the MBA, I went back to my country and launched, together with a group, a business for low-income customers, a grocery chain for low-income customers, and the business is going well. Now we're back here in Boston. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Have I missed anyone, except for the panelists, of course? Okay, so just to say a word myself, so I'm delighted to see survivors of my teaching in the room. Welcome back. Again, I'm a newbie. I'm only here 11 years. But I have to say, I understand what Sharon's talking about. There is a kind of absorbing state nature of MIT, right? It kind of pulls you in, and it keeps you engaged. With that, I'm going to be mercifully brief. Yes, I'm going to ask our panelists. Actually, you know, I know I won't do justice if I introduce you. Right? I'm going to ask you to self-introduce. After all, this is the reason they're here, is to see you. So, Stu, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. The word, so Stu Meyer has been a colleague and co-conspirator on many things in my time here. I'll I'll give it to you. I've heard that he's a comrade in arms, that he was one of the directors of the program, though we don't know how long ago. I can't quite pin it down.
It was back in the 70s, and I was very young at the time. But actually, I was very young at the time, younger than you are now. So I want to not only echo the thanks to Sharon Cayley, but I was thinking today of Katie Scott, who was in your role when I was running it. And like you, she ran the program. And notice, I did not say what Sharon just said. Sharon just said she ran the program behind the scenes. Katie Scott ran the program and basically told me what to do. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the administrative people who run this program are exceptionally important because the faculty have lots of other, are absent-minded anyway, and have so many other things in their plate that if without somebody not just doing the administrative work, but making sure that you're in the right place at the right time and everything gets attended to is exceptionally important. So if Katie were here, I'd give her a round of applause as well. So one thing Sharon did was to fish out copies of memos that I wrote with regard to the doctoral program between 1972 and 1974. And talk about memory lane, this was really pretty amazing. For example, one of the memos that I wrote was part of an effort to convince MIT to let us have our own application forms for the MBA and doctoral programs, and basically to handle everything administratively about admissions. Before that, everything went through MIT Central. If you came into the MIT doctoral program, I guess you must have filled out the same application form, Sloan doctoral program. I guess you filled out the same application form as if you were going to get a PhD in chemistry or something. So we actually, that was the time when we brought everything in-house and had to design our own application form. I have the application form that Katie and I designed, and the application fee was $15. So the other interesting thing you see from these memos is that it was designed as a PhD in management with functional fields. Functional field might be finance or 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 organizational behavior, but it was designed as a PhD in management. And that's very different than it is now. So for example, although it was a PhD in management and there was a breadth requirement, you had to, every student coming through the program had to show that he or she had at least some exposure to organizational behavior, let's say, some exposure to mathematics, some exposure to economics. In other words, they had to have a broad view of management. So let me just read this paragraph from a memo I prepared at the time trying to describe what the doctoral program requirements are, because I think it's sort of interesting. It says, breadth requirement. A fundamental requirement of the program has been that students demonstrate competence in 3 basic disciplines of economics, behavioral science, and mathematics. The rationale for this requirement is that management, quotation marks, is not in itself a social science, but a meeting place for the various social sciences. The common element is the set of management problems rather than the specific approaches or disciplines. It follows that those who do research in management lead at least an appreciation of methodologies other than their own specialty. Now, that actually sounds like a goal still worth pursuing, but in fact, it's the sort of thing that we hope happens, but you can't really require happens nowadays. What has happened is that the fields, which we first thought of as specialties, functional specialties, or application areas like finance or OR, marketing, whatever, have become research disciplines in their own right. And therefore, the administration of the program has devolved back to these fields. So Lottie in organizational behavior you're running your own program, and we in finance are essentially running our own program in finance, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you may think that that is a sad thing, but I believe you cannot turn back the clock. The fields have developed to such an extent, and that the requirements of mastering a field, I'll take my own field as an example. The requirements to a doctoral student starting out having to master the field of finance are enormous. The amount of material that a finance doctoral student has to master in order to get to the point where they're competent in the field is, I believe, an order of magnitude greater than what I had to master when I was doing my own doctorate way back in those ancient times in the 1960s. And by the way, it's not just 10 times greater in terms of volume. I think it's 10 times greater in terms of the technical sophistication of the research that's done. You can't pick up an article today and read it casually and know what has been done. It was possible in my day to pick up an article, many articles at least, and read them casually and say, okay, I understand. I understand the basic point, or I understand what the methodology is and how they got from the assumptions or the data or the methodology to the results. So we're essentially forced now, I think, to run the fields separately. And so what brings us all together? Well, you could think of the Sloan School or other major business schools as a set of more or less distinct research disciplines that are brought together by a common educational program and by a common student and alumni base. I suppose by a common social organization, because we're all friends, even though we're not necessarily reading each other's papers. But you don't have the same, we don't attempt to have the same intellectual cohesion across fields that we would have when I was running this program and helping run this program in the 1970s. Now, going back, actually one more thing occurs to me about the program. Because it was viewed as at that time as a program in management, the faculty doctoral committee actually met as a committee of the whole to consider all major decisions. So, for example, when every year at about this time, when the students finished their general exams, the committee would meet as a whole to try to review the performance of each student and so either say, yes, great, go on to do the dissertation, oops, no, we got some problems, and what do we do about it? The committee also met as a committee of the whole when it came to admissions. So we actually had representatives of the various groups meet and talk through all the candidates, regardless of field, and to try to come up with a list of who to admit and who not. Now, you can imagine that was not always an easy conversation. But from that, I learned one of the really important lessons of management. You want to hear it? Okay. You've heard the whole idea of herding cats, right? And faculty are like that, but human beings are like that anyway. So my principle of management is if you have a herd of cats and they have to come to some agreement on something, you lock them up and don't let them out until they're done. And I literally did that. We'd pick a Saturday morning like this and say, okay, it's admission time. We're going to stock the room with all sorts of calories and soft drinks and everything so you don't have an excuse to go out for food. And basically told everyone that we cannot leave until we've agreed on the list of students who are admitted. Okay? Now, you may think I'm joking, but this trick works. I've tried it with, when we were running the International Financial Services Center, we had sponsors from various corporations. So we'd have somebody from BP, and we'd have somebody from Citi, and we'd have somebody from, I forget, Bankers Trust, and so on. And again, we had to get those cats together to agree on what advice they were going to give us about the research program. How do you do it? You lock them up. Until you get out. Pardon me?
I think I need to try
Right. Yes.
they locked people up, but they didn't supply food.
Anyway, that's all ancient history. Let me go back and just make one more comment on the way the fields have developed. I said that, just, again, forgive me for thinking of finance because that's what I know best, but what a doctoral student has to master now in order to be credible in finance, it really is an order of magnitude greater than what I was asked to master when I was starting out. Now, to be sure, in the 1960s, what we call now modern finance was just starting up, but still the point holds. And so we have of course, our students are exceptionally bright and exceptionally talented. In finance now, you might be interested to know, we have something in the order of what, 200 and, how many applications we have in finance? 200 plus?
Average is about 225, 250.
250 applications for doctoral students in finance for 6 slots. So you can imagine the students are all exceptionally qualified from an academic point of view. And so by the time they reach their generals in the second year, they know a lot. Which then reminds me of this joke that George Shultz used to tell on himself. George Shultz, of course, had a PhD here, and he was an academic, and he was a really smart guy. And George imagined a group of farmers sitting around the wood stove and Cracker Barrel in a general store, and one of the farmers would say, "Yep, that George Shultz, he sure does know a lot." And the next one would say, "Yep, George got a PhD. He must know everything." And then the third one says, "Yep, George Shultz sure knows a lot, but he don't realize nothing." And so, you know, in the end, we come to the same problem with doctoral students. They pass their generals. They sure do know a lot, but they don't necessarily realize what it takes to advance the field. And the really hard thing about running a doctoral program is to help students over that hurdle, to get to the point where they realize what it takes to advance the field and not just stuff their brain with more stuff. And frankly, if I knew how to teach that reliably, I think it would be an incredible advance. But the students end up doing it themselves, somehow. They end up doing it themselves, and our doctoral students taken as a group have been exceptionally productive and influential. The only idea I have to explain how they managed to get over that hurdle of from knowing things to realizing things comes back to the following riddle, okay? So why is it that the French are such good cooks? And the answer to that riddle is they know what good food tastes like. Right? In other words, so they demand good food because they know what good food is. And by the way, you can't always say that in the United States. And I think what really happens with a doctoral program is that if the doctoral student is around here for 4 years paying attention, going all the research seminars, and listening to the conversations that go on about research at a place where the faculty are really good, somehow they learn what good research tastes like. And that's in the end why I think the doctoral program does as well as it does. Okay, thanks.
Lottie, would you like to go next? Or do we have questions? Yeah, we have some questions. Yeah.
So I'm curious.
I'm going to play Donahue for those of you who know who that is.
That was a while ago.
It is a while ago.
So your comment about the original structure of the PhD program and now the more focused disciplines brings a question to my mind, which is, in the past, it seems to me, what you were doing was creating or grooming people to go out and actually be captains of industry or CEOs or something like that, because you require that broad background in order to be able to manage a company. With this stovepiping of the disciplines and the pinpoint focus, it seems to me like what you're doing is creating a group of people who are extremely focused in their one discipline, but could end up creating unforeseen consequences because they are not aware of the other potential effects of what they're doing. For example, complex derivatives. I'd like to know whether the focus or the goal of the program has changed over the years, or what is the goal of these PhD programs?
Okay, I should have clarified. The goal of the program has always been to produce people who do research. I mean, ideally, our students will go out and become distinguished professors of whatever the field is at some other good business school. Or maybe, in a lot of cases, we manage to bring the best of them back here. So the doctoral program is never intended to produce managers in the same way as an MBA program does. Back in the 70s, I think even when the doctoral program now, you understand the line I'm drawing between the doctoral program and the MBA program. Even though we were trying to do a PhD in management somehow, it really, when the rubber hit the road, it all came down to the dissertation, and that was always in a particular field or a particular discipline. And that's where the success or failure finally came. Now, it's sort of interesting that most of our doctoral students, again, I'm speaking more for my own field maybe than others, did go into academic jobs. Some of them later ended up on Wall Street. Some of them turned out to be very effective managers, I think, and not necessarily siloed in the way you say. But of course, that's always a danger. It's always a danger with specialization. So I'm not going to give you a Pollyanna view that the specialization that naturally occurs in a research discipline is potentially dangerous if it's just dropped down to the middle of a big organization.
Yes, each of you represents, I think without much exaggeration, a field that either started here at Sloan or was largely built up in its early days here at Sloan. And there's certainly more than 4 different fields of research that started here. And I just, reflecting on Stu's comments, and maybe as we go along, each of you could reflect, how do we start new and important fields of endeavor and research if we're becoming so structured and so deeply embedded in methods and maybe, well, and approaches unique to each field, so that we have trouble talking as a committee of the whole.
I'll pass it on to you.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not even going to try. I'll echo some of what Stu said. There are also some differences. I'll be speaking primarily from the basis of BPS, which is the Behavioral and Policy Sciences area.
Then you should say who you are.
Oh, sorry. I'm Lottie Balin, and I'm in what we call OSG, which is the Organization Studies Group, as part of BPS area, which is Behavioral and Policy Sciences. So I wanted to say a few things about the PhD program in general, and then really shift to BPS in some way. And I was chair of the PhD program, or whatever we called, in the 80s. So it was actually before we had centralized PhD admissions. And what you said about before we had decentralized, what you said about the centralized was always a problem for us, because being centralized, the emphasis was very much on the quantitative scores, and which, as you can imagine, your applicants were much better at than ours. And for us, it was really important verbal scores, because writing is so much a part of the work that we do. So it was, in a way, a relief when the applications were decentralized, because we would always lose out to your people. But the PhD program in general is a real paradox, because it costs a lot of money, and it's probably the one loss center of the school. And yet, from the faculty point of view, it's probably the most important thing. I mean, how do we learn once we've been here a long time? We learn from our graduate students. And that, I mean by that, the doctoral students. And as you know, we have a small program, and so the faculty is always asking for more students, and the school is always pushing back. And that's where you have the paradox. And when you ask who wins, you only have to look at Sharon's data. In the first year, 1962, there were 44 applicants, 19 were accepted, and 12 came. In this last year, 2011, there were 645 applicants. That's a big change. 25 were accepted, and 12 came. So you haven't had much of a rate of growth for 50 years. It stayed more or less the same. And that creates this tension that it's a very expensive program, but it's very important to the faculty and how to create some scale in it. And I'll get back to that a little. But I also want to pick up on what Stu said and really go back to the original proposal, where management was very much seen as an applied field. And in fact, they thought of the proposal, at the time, there were most management educators. So it was to train people to go into the academy. And most management educators were actually discipline trained, and they wanted to augment this by training some people directly in the applied field. And I'll read you a quote of what they said and how they saw the proposal. And, quote, "The proposal was designed to produce such men, to produce men who were in the applied field." And indeed, in 1962, it was all men. The first woman PhD to graduate was in 1977. So there was a long. But to give you a funny anecdote, we had an OSD, an Organization Studies meeting the other day, going over all our current doctoral students, and every single one was a woman. So we've come around. But let me go back a little bit to BPS. You know, so when I came 40 years ago, there were no areas yet. There were only groups. So I entered as part of the Organization Studies group, which was very much oriented to social psychology and group dynamics. Indeed, a lot of those fields started here, as Jim made the point. And in fact, at that time, there was a very practice-oriented group as part of the group. Namely, it was an organization development group. It was an OD group. And the interesting thing, and it's part of the change that you were talking about, it was very hard to keep those faculty. We had a lot of faculty who were doing this kind of work, but moving them up the tenure track became very difficult. And that's, I think, a surprising part of MIT, that MIT itself is so centralized that all appointments go through a central academic council. So the Sloan appointments have to compete with the physics appointments and the math appointments, and which is very different from Harvard Business School or Wharton, who have a life of their own. And so I think that contributed partly to that the Sloan people had to meet the same criteria as the science people, the faculty, as they moved up the rank. And the very practice-oriented people sort of fell by the wayside. And so I agree that this practice orientation, which I think was in the original proposal, is beginning to fade. But there are not exactly innovative, new fields, but certainly BPS has recently added very discipline-oriented kinds of field. We've recently added economic sociology, which is a thriving part of sociology in general. And we graduated the first, right, Sharon? Yes. The first PhD in that area, which is really interesting because MIT doesn't have a sociology department. And there are sociologists at the institute, but they're spread all over, and there's no particular department. And in that original vision, that original proposal, sociology wasn't even mentioned as an underlying discipline. And now, at least within BPS, I would guess that the underlying discipline of our doctoral students is more frequently sociology than, for example, economics. I think that's been a real shift. We've also recently added a behavioral lab. Now, there was a lot of experimental social psychology at the beginning here, and then it sort of faded, and it is now back. And so there's, again, a renewed emphasis on experimental social psychology. And these are sort of two new areas within BPS that have recently come back. And of course, we still have technology and entrepreneurship and strategy and industrial relations, now called the Institute for Work and Employment Research. And one of the key things that indicates this discipline orientation that I think Sloan is fairly unusual in both its faculty and its PhD students honoring more their publications in discipline-oriented journals than in the journals of the Academy of Management, which typically the other business schools, I think, would see those, the Academy of Management journals, as the highest prestige. And here it's very much the discipline journals. So we recently had a review of the whole PhD program, and we got pretty high marks, except that they thought we should be teaching a few more PhD courses. The students, for example, who take sociology as their underlying discipline often have to go to the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences in order to get their basic discipline course. And I think many of us would love to do that. Teaching, as I said, the PhD students are the joy of the faculty. But we're a little bit caught up in a point system where the allocation of how much you teach is measured by points, and points go for large classes. So it's a little bit hard to do that. But in general, speaking again for BPS, we've got an excellent PhD program, the goal being really, and we emphasize that quite a lot, to train academics. We see that as our leverage, that we have such a small program. In all of BPS, we get about 6 students a year, so that a group like Organization Studies might get 1 or none at any year. So I think one difference might be from EFA, that BPS as a whole is now a fair cohort, and the PhD students come together. They do take, and they have both formal and informal colloquia, so it's not, I suspect, quite as decentralized as you are. But the program is very small, and we're lucky that we have this cohesion across the groups in BPS, and the resources, trying to get this scale up is a problem. But we love the PhD students, and we have a new lovely building, and the students have windows in their offices, so I hope that they're fairly happy.
Thank you, Lottie. If I could just add a word before we turn to Jim Orland. I've been thinking about your question and about our specialization. I think I agree with everything that's been said about how we're a small program and we try to leverage academics. That's what we're good at. We're trying to teach people how to do research. But when I think about, Jim, where are we going to get new areas? I have to say, the one thing I guess I would add to what Lottie said is that I learn a lot from the MBAs as well. And indeed, the MBA students and the Sloan Fellows as well, when they come through, one of the things they do is they put me in touch with some real live companies. And so I'm reflecting, just yesterday, I had the CEO of a company in my office made connection through the MBA, and it looks like we're going to be doing some research, which I think will be useful for the company, but also, frankly, I think will produce a PhD student at the end of this. So while there is this tendency to narrow, because we need to show our, we do have, I think the world has changed, we do have to compete in these disciplines. I think actually the big leverage that we have is that we get in contact with management phenomena. And so I predict, Jim, that it'll come through that kind of contact that we'll start to see some of these things coming together. Now, again, I'm the interim director, but I don't think I'm saying anything that Ezra Zuckerman would disagree with. It's certainly consistent with the views of how we've been doing business, at least in the behavioral and policy sciences. Though from what I can tell, the same thing is going on in the other areas as well. So with that, pardon the interruption, Jim Orland, please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me here. I joined Sloan in 1979 as a faculty member in operations research, or as I've been saying as of 2 days ago, operations research and business analytics, because no one really seems to have heard of operations research. I came with a BA in math, an MS in math, an M math, and almost a PhD in operations research, which I got after joining the faculty. And I knew almost nothing about management, nothing about organizational studies, very little about economics. And I don't know if it's a coincidence, but I'm also the head of the PhD program that led to the largest organizational change since the start of the program. So perhaps it was not knowing things that helped out. I don't know. In any case, I joined the PhD program in committee in 1980, and we've heard a little bit about the committee. And from 1960 on, it had been a school-wide program. We heard about some of it. The requirements across the school were actually somewhat minimalist. I mean, people did need to know organizational studies and economics and a little bit of math, which turned into management science as a requirement. But it was somewhat minimalist. There was joint oversight of the program, which is pretty interesting. And the one thing that really caught my attention was the admissions process, which I was not a huge fan of. We admitted people by having everyone, in the school get together locked in a room. By the time I was there, it was without food, so I liked it even less. And the problem with it was that we looked at PhD students very differently across the school, and we still had to make a joint decision. So for example, if you looked at some groups, let's say finance, they really liked people who were great quantitatively and who were star students. And then if you looked at a group like organizational studies or other groups in what was later called BPS, they would tend to like students whose English skills were much stronger. And in addition, they really liked experience. So, when we would go to these meetings, we would sort of be arguing cross purposes with some people saying, we don't want that student because that student doesn't know math well enough, and other people saying, we don't want that student because they don't seem very mature, even though they're really smart. So that was very striking to me. And eventually, well, a little bit more background on myself. In the fall of 1987, I decided, I was now actually a full professor. I'd become full professor the spring before. And I decided maybe it was time for me to learn management. It was an idea. Anyway, what I did was I became the first faculty member at Sloan to become a student in our senior executives program. And I became, that was fall of, now I'm forgetting, I think it was fall of '87. And it's a 9-week program. I was the sole faculty member that year. I was actually the second youngest person of the senior executives. And I was definitely the only one who didn't know management. And it was a lot of fun. I got to interact with senior executives. I got to see other faculty in the school teach. I got to see lots of examples of really good teaching. And it was great. I learned a lot. And right afterwards, after the program, they asked me if I wanted to be head of the PhD program. And I was absolutely brimming with overconfidence and said yes. So I became head of the PhD program. Now, question comes up like, what I was responsible for was the decentralization of the program. Basically, for people who believed in the program and the dream of it being unified in management, another way of saying it was I was the one responsible for killing the dream. But, how did I come up with that idea? And it boiled down to accounting at MIT, accounting methods. What I did was I was looking at the different ways that accounting methods were done at MIT, and I became convinced that if we spent money a little differently and combined research money and fellowship money, we could do things a lot more efficiently. And I talked with people in the other areas of the school. I'm in management science. We talked with people in other areas, and they had no interest whatsoever. So I thought, how about if we control funding differently? Now, it turns out I was totally wrong in terms of the funding. So as I thought about the idea of decentralization in order to save money, within a week, I had realized that it wasn't going to save any money and it was worthless. But within that week, I had fallen in love with the idea of decentralization. So it was too late. And so I thought of the arguments for decentralization. The major arguments were that people would really try to admit their own students the way they liked. Actually, what had happened in the admissions process is that people would have a twofold position if one of their students didn't get through. So they would say, I really want this student. And then someone would say, well, but they're terrible at math. And they'd say, no, this is a great student. And if we argued and the person lost, they would pull a student out of their pocket, essentially, at the meeting and say, how about this student? And it would always be a student who was really good at math and who was a student who would be perfectly acceptable to the committee, but someone who they didn't really like as much. I thought, this isn't good that we're playing this sort of game of if we can't get who we like, we'll just get somebody who we can. So that was one aspect. And I liked the idea of people having sort of more local control and figured that people would spend money a little bit differently. OK, so those were some of the advantages that I thought. And so what I wanted to do then was to talk about decentralization and figure out how it could be done, but ran into two stumbling blocks. Okay. The first was we were going to split up funding. And there were several possible ways of splitting up the fellowship funding. One way, well, let's put it this way. coincidentally, the 3 areas of the school had a very strong preference for the way that would give them the most money. This is just a coincidence because they were arguing it entirely on philosophical grounds, which we are very good at. I think one of the differences between a smart person and a person who's not so smart is that a smart person can argue anything and make it sound good, whereas the not smart person can even argue things that are correct and not make it sound so good. Okay, so one stumbling block was that, and here's what we eventually did. I actually have a note as to how it works. Each area received 1/6, there are 3 areas, each received 1/6 of the fellowship money plus 1/2 times their number of full-time faculty divided by the number of full-time faculty at the school. And you might think that was chosen because it's hard to understand, but actually it was my idea. And that is what happened. And eventually people changed it to something more sensible, but that was the compromise position. The other thing that was a stumbling block is it wasn't clear who could make the decision on decentralizing the program into 3 parts. You know, was it the PhD program who would make the decision? Was it the policy committee at the school? Was it the deans? So I did what came to me most naturally was to not figure it out, just not worry about it, and to get all 3 groups to say yes. So I talked with people talked with the program leaders in the different areas, got buy-in from them. Then we went to the PhD program committee, got buy-in from it. In the meantime, I had talked with Lester Thoreau, who was dean at that time. Lester, incidentally, one of the things I liked best about Lester is he had incredibly efficient meetings. Normally, when I have a meeting, I'll just sort of like talk for a long time, and it goes for a long time. But I'd walk in with Lester, and I'd say, here's the background in 5 minutes, and he'd say, oh, here's what you want to do. Looks good. Really? You know, this was resolved in 7 minutes? But that would be a typical meeting with Lester. So anyway, the deans approved, then we went to the policy committee, and they approved. And so eventually it became the rule. And I think it wasn't so much to create silos in the school, or I don't even think that was a result. It was much more that the areas had personal autonomy over their PhD program and more investment and also more ability to make fine-grained decisions, including requirements that made sense. So if you look at BPS, they have a number of requirements across the area that make a lot of sense to their faculty. Management science has more of a structure that students have to follow, which achieves a lot of breadth, but not necessarily breadth across the area. It's breadth in different ways. Okay, so a couple of results that happened because of this. One is my own group, OR Stat. We had a PhD program that really duplicated the Operations Research Center. And the reason we had that PhD program was because essentially fellowship money was a free good. And so we wanted to take the fellowship money and not throw it away. We figured we'd bring in good doctoral students. But after the decentralization, we actually ended up with control of that fellowship money, and we decided that we would stop the PhD program at Sloan, which was largely duplicative, and allocate the money to PhD students in the Operations Research Center as we saw fit. So we got rid of that duplication. Applied economics did something different. Applied economics decided that it didn't need to keep its PhD program, and it gave all its fellowship money to finance. So I always found this. Now, here's what I wrote here. As far as I can tell, this is because economists are by nature altruistic, and they rarely think of their own interests. Just joking. I have no idea why they did it. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, Vonda.
Okay, well,
The
thank
floor
you.
is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Wanda Rikowski, and delighted to be on this panel to celebrate this really wonderful accomplishment of 50 years of the doctoral program. I guess on this panel, I'm the sort of rookie, right? I only joined the Sloan School in '89, so I've only been here 22 years. And I've really benefited from the leadership and wisdom of my colleagues who have led the doctoral program, because I think the changes that have been implemented over those years have been really beneficial to me. So I really want to thank my colleagues and also echo the thanks to Sharon, who's led us and really managed this program wonderfully over her time here. So the doctoral program has been enormously important to my work here at Sloan. I'm in the Information Technologies group. I joined in, as I said, '89. And then a few years later, also joined the Organization Studies group. So I'm actually in two groups across two areas, which is a very interesting position. But it really reflects the kind of research work I do, which is to study the organizational implications of technology in the workplace. So I draw heavily on social and organizational perspectives, and I bring that to bear on the sort of technological realities of people having to use tools in the workplace. And so that nice meshing of social and organizational and technological aspects is really very important. And so participating in both these communities has been enormously helpful. And I've also been able to participate in both these doctoral programs, both within management science and within BPS. So, you know, educating students is a real privilege. It's a pleasure. It's also a real privilege, you know, to be part of the personal and intellectual development of students. And I think it's something that all of us, I'm sure I speak for everybody on the faculty here, who just finds it just sort of enormously gratifying thing to be doing. And I think for us, the doctoral students have a very special place, in part because, you know, they're trying to become like us, right? So we're you know, creating students who want to be faculty. So there's a very special connection there, in part because I think we remember ourselves in the doctoral program. And so there's a very particular relationship, I think, we have with doctoral students who are sort of like our apprentices in their time here. And as I say, it's a real privilege to be able to be part of their intellectual development. And I think it's an obligation that we all feel to try and develop the best researchers we can so as to ensure the health and vitality of management scholarship, you know, for generations to come. And so I think we take that very seriously here. And I think the kinds of changes you've seen described by my colleagues has really strengthened that commitment to educating future management scholars, both at Sloan but then through business schools throughout. It's been mentioned that the doctoral program is a cost center and it's a loss to the school, and I guess by some accounting that's true, but I like to think of it as a real investment. It's an investment in our future, because I think management scholarship depends on high quality, high class faculty, and the PhD program is the way in which we generate high class, high quality management scholars who go on to become faculty in the top business schools. So I sort of think of it as an investment. And I'm very grateful that the Sloan School is continuing to invest in that program. It is a pity that Ezra Zuckerman, who's our current head, couldn't be here. But as Roberta mentioned, he's, fortunately for him, on sabbatical and will be back. But in his time, in his first year here, he, and with Roberto's help and Joanne Yates's help, did initiate an external review. I think it was the first external review of our doctoral program. And I think that's bringing in a whole lot of very useful information to us in terms of how might we continue to improve and strengthen the doctoral program. So I think that's been enormously helpful to be a little reflective on what's working, what isn't working, and what might we do to improve even further going forward. I'd like to reflect just a little bit on some of the decentralizing initiatives that I guess started with Stu when he moved us a little bit away from MIT-wide admissions, and then Jim, who moved us away from school-wide admissions, because I certainly remember those day-long meetings locked up in And I'm going to add one thing to that. We were locked up in a windowless room in the basement of E52. I mean, I don't know if, I certainly remember with horror those musty windowless room in E52 in the basement that for some reason, there must have been some logic behind that, that the locking and the windowless would really sort of compound to bring us to an agreement. But as has already been said, I think it was a very hard process. And it became harder over time because the world had changed. And as already been said, the business world had changed and become much more complex. And so the kind of people we were trying to admit so that we could train to be the best researchers in these distinctive fields needed to be different. They needed to be more specialized and have deeper knowledge than the more general applied knowledge that perhaps had been truer in the 50s and the 60s when the program was first conceived. So I think as we move towards a more decentralized structure, I was very struck by Jim's comments about the logic behind that move, because I thought it was a stroke of, a deep insight rather than, as you described it, because I saw it very much as reflecting what was happening in the world. And if we look in the business world, what we saw in the certainly late 80s, but 90s and so on, was a move towards much more decentralized, distributed, more diverse phenomena. And I thought that it was appropriate that our doctoral program should reflect more of that structure that we were in fact trying to study in the world. So I actually saw it as deeply insightful.
Thank you. That is the illusion I tried to give people.
Well, whatever, it was inadvertent, it was very beneficial. And we certainly immediately felt that. For example, in the information technologies group that I am part of, ours is a very applied field. We try and study technologies and their applications in business, but we were also very interested in the multifaceted nature of the applications of technology in business. So there are economic aspects, there are very much social and organizational aspects, and there are also technological aspects. And so being able to manage and control our own admissions allowed us to bring in students who could run the gamut of both having economic interests, but also social and organizational interests, but also technological interests, and be able to manage their development through our programs and drawing on, of course, courses throughout Sloan, and to really develop them particularly effectively. We could design our courses and design our requirements to reflect the kinds of students that we thought would be best equipped to study those complex, diverse phenomena around, essentially these broad digitization movements that are happening everywhere. So just for example, right now in our current crop of doctoral students in information technologies, we have students who are studying new econometric ways of valuing IT investment. We have students studying the cultural implications of robots in healthcare. We have people trying to measure and enable collective intelligence across distributed collaborative communities. We have people trying to design more effective enterprise-wide technologies. So it's, the full gamut, as I said, of implications of technology in the world, and we're able to create students who are equipped to do that range of research, in part because I think we've been able to decentralize the program. It's been enormously beneficial, I think, in helping us strengthen and enrich the kinds of education we can provide our doctoral students. So thank you.
It is my great pleasure. We're being joined by Nitin Noria, an alum of the Sloan PhD program and the current dean of the Harvard Business School. Can we welcome him, please, to join us?
So does it mean I get to go?
You do.
I can't tell you what a wonderful moment this is for me to be here with people who created this program as a product of the program. So I feel blessed. I feel blessed to be here because there's people in this room who gave me every opportunity that I thought I could never have. So it's a great moment for me to be able to say thank you. So I want to just reflect on three things that I feel the PhD program at Sloan gave me and at MIT gave me that have been deeply powerful ways in which I have been influenced for all my life. The first moment came to me very recently. I was at a event where we had a dinner that was in a room which was our gymnasium, because we could only find a room that was that large, where we had all of the people who are fellowship recipients at MIT, at Harvard Business School, join the people who gave their fellowships. So this is a room in which all of the people who gave fellowships to our students, people don't realize this, but about half of our students get some form of fellowship. So all of the student recipients were there with the people who provided these fellowships. And I had the opportunity, as I now find I have more and more opportunity to do, to say a few words. So I remember standing up in front of the room, and for the first time I was so moved that the words didn't come out. Anything that I had planned couldn't come out, because I realized that I was standing in front of a room that in some ways had enabled an opportunity for these students that I had received at MIT. And that I'd never had an occasion in which I could stand up and thank the person who gave me a fellowship that allowed me to come to MIT. Because it was an anonymous fellowship. And I remember telling people that I was very surprised as a student at IIT Bombay, the proudest and happiest moment of my life, when I got this letter from from MIT's PhD program saying, congratulations. Right? That first word, as soon as you read that, your heart races. And you say, congratulations, you have been admitted to the PhD program at MIT. And I said, as much as my heart raced at that moment, I had to read beyond that first line. Because if there wasn't a second paragraph that said, and you're going to get a fellowship to come, the first line could have been simply an empty line. It would have made no difference whatsoever. So that letter was the beginning of creating opportunity for me. I often tell people that I am a living example of the American dream. But I am a living example of something that is much more than the American dream. Because when I came to MIT, if someone had told me that someday you would become dean of Harvard Business School, it would have been an impossible thing to even dream. And yet, this institution, which gave me my first opportunity, set me on a path in which more opportunity came to me than I ever thought I was either gifted or lucky or anything to enjoy. And yet those opportunities kept coming. But it all started with that one letter. So I think that what MIT gave me more than anything else is first and foremost an opportunity to dream and to have every dream of mine seem more modest, because there was a better dream to dream just the next day. And that started from my first day here. My first day here, I thought all I could do was survive. But people made me feel, no, you're a scholar. You don't just have to think about surviving. You have to ask yourself the question, what more can you do? Don Lassard was the first person whom I met. And Joanne Yates, who's right here, allowed me to trundle her AV equipment across the entire school. And if I couldn't trundle that AV equipment across the entire school and earn $12 an hour, I wouldn't have been able to feed myself. So thank you, Joanne. But this is so here you are on the one hand saying, how can I make sure that in the break between my classes I can trundle the AV equipment to get it from room to room in time? And from there you end up saying, I can have any intellectual imagination I can have, and the opportunity that is available to you is endless. So that's the first thing that MIT gave me, for which I will eternally be grateful. The second thing that I got from MIT, which is no less important, is a deep sense of intellectual identity. The thing I realized very quickly upon coming here is that I had to find my own intellectual voice. This is not a school that encouraged or cultivated anybody becoming anybody's apprentice or acolyte. that the whole culture was a culture that said, find your own intellectual voice. I was a chemical engineer. I knew that I didn't know anything about what I was getting into. In fact, I came here thinking that I was going to study international finance. That's what I was admitted to study, working with Don Lassaud. But the encouragement that someone who was at the center of that field was, there's this first-year general program where you can get all of these other courses. Don't close your mind yet on what it is that you might want to study. Go out and explore it openly. And in that program, I ended up happening to meet Mike Puri and Chuck Sable, who had just published their book, The Second Industrial Divide. I met John Van Manen, who had just published his book on Disney World. I ended up meeting people whom I'd never known of, never thought about. I didn't even know that these were things that you could study in any way, shape, or form. And because I had the opportunity to study that, I fell in love with this very different set of stuff than I ever thought I would do. So I graduated from MIT with a sense of what I wanted to do. A committee that still seems you could only construct at MIT. Don Lassaud, Eleanor Westney, Mike Puri, John Van Manen, and Mel Horwich. A historian, a sociologist, an economist, a labor economist, and an ethnographer. Now, imagine them coming together. Like none of them actually really knew what I was doing. Only I knew what I was doing, but they were all willing to help, and that was the extraordinary thing about MIT. And it gave me this confidence that never ever hesitate to have your own intellectual voice. It's something that has benefited me immensely through my entire time in academics. I have always been courageous to do things that I felt were worth doing. And I figured that I'd always be able to assemble the resources to get the help that I needed to get to study it, because that's what MIT taught me I could do. It was an extraordinary place that from the first day said, find your own intellectual voice. I'm very grateful for that, because that has shaped who I am as an academic. And I think that in my own role as having left and graduated from here, having run the OB PhD program at Harvard for many, many years, I tried in many ways to try and instill that same belief among our PhD students, that it was very important for them to find their own voice. And I also teach them the one lesson that I learned from Lottie Balin, that this relationship between theory and data, which everybody thinks is a linear relationship, that you have a theory, then you gather data to test it, and then you verify the theory or not, is like a joke. That in fact the relationship between theory and data, I still remember this line that you drew up, Lottie, in one of our first classes, where you had one line that says theory, another line that says data, and then you just drew curves that go back and forth and said that's in fact the way it operates. So it's really interesting that you can remember and recall with ease these moments from your experience here that provide a very deep sense of intellectual identity. And I think that all of us who are graduates of this program will recognize that there's a sense in which this school and this experience embeds in you an intellectual identity that is very distinctive and very profound, and one which you have no choice if you're going but to develop your own intellectual voice. The third thing that I would say about MIT's PhD program that has had an equally profound influence on me is what I would call a philosophy in terms of the relationship between academics and the rest of the world. I think that this comes back to the very philosophy of MIT, of which the Sloan School is a part. Men et manus. That you have to have an intimate relationship between ideas and the world of practice. Even though people were not thrilled when I went to Harvard Business School, when I graduated from here, I must say that was, so it's nice to be back as someone who's now celebrated many, many years later for having made that choice. It was not the choice that most people thought I should make when I first graduated. It's interesting that I'm surprised that anybody at MIT would have been surprised that that would have been the place that drew me the most. Because what drew me to Harvard Business School was, in fact, this deep philosophy that I learned at MIT, which is what is very, very important, is to make sure that we are in a business in which ideas are an intimate and constant engagement with the world of practice. And if we don't produce ideas that have power in practice, there's something that is deeply lost in terms of what you want to do with the ideas that you generate. And that's what made me always feel at home at Harvard Business School, because I think that Harvard Business School is an institution where, at least at the business school, that is as deeply committed to that philosophy as I think MIT is as a university as a whole. I don't think that that would be true for all of Harvard as a whole. I think it's true for MIT as a whole, that you have to be a place in which what you do is deeply connected to the world of practice. That has animated all of my work. It's a philosophy that I think is the most important philosophy for us to sustain in educational institutions. Because if we don't, at some point of time, we will lose legitimacy with the very institutions that have to support what we do. Because we exist, because we produce ideas that in the end benefit the world. And I think that that's a very important part of how we need to think about the work that we do. It's what animates me every day as Dean of Harvard Business School, to continue to be seen as an institution which has a mission that is not unlike MIT's mission, to educate leaders who make a difference in the world. I was struck as I was coming in about how that has now been, in fact, ensconced right there. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have that, because it reminds me that now this entrance feels like the entrance at Mass Ave of all of MIT, where you stand and you look in the big rotunda and you can see the mission of the university. It's nice to know that you have that same sense of power now, of experiencing the mission of MIT as you come in. But I think that that's a very powerful thing that we need to act upon, and I at least got the first importance of that and began to understand the importance of that the many times I walked through the rotunda and looked up, and when I came to MIT discovered how important it was to what I was learning. So those are the three things that I carry away from this place as deep things that have influenced me, for which I am deeply grateful. Along the way and along the ride, there are many individual people. Sharon, who was always there to be a field guide through this amazing place. Many, many faculty members who at MIT make you feel, as a doctoral student, like a colleague, something that I think is very special about this culture. The fact that you have offices in the midst of the faculty, which I hope is something that we can still protect now that you have a new building. But these are things that have made the PhD program really special. So again, it's a great celebration. 50 years of the PhD program, 150 years of MIT. Thank you for having me.
We have a minute or two if I'd like to open it up to questions to the panel. Please. Let me come to you, please. I have to play Donahue.
Or Oprah.
It was very humbling listening to all of you talk about the depth of the fields that you are in, and to be reassured that MIT Sloan is working at the edges of knowledge, not sort of at the backyard. I have a question though. As these individual disciplines with their depth evolve or are developed and are born here, will there be a discipline that connects them together? Will management, even though it's not a social science in itself, be a field in which one could have this connective tissue, or to look at all of it together? I'm reminded of when I was here at Sloan, and by the way, Nitin was very helpful in suggesting me which program to enroll in. We read, and I think Sturman talked about it, that there was a patient who went to a doctor. He went to 3 specialists, and he was treated in 3 different ways. In reality, he only had a migraine. So each of the professors who consult to the industry out there, for example, are giving their depth and perspective. But is there a connective tissue across an integrative field of management that will evolve out of Sloan at the 150th year of MIT?
A challenge?
I'll answer that. And I think the answer is no. And it's better to think of it as a big tent with lots of things happening underneath it. And as long as the different performers in the tent are talking to each other and ideas get passed back and forth, I think that's fine. I think the attempt to design a way of getting everybody in the tent to march to exactly the same beat or in exactly the same, or in some common way. Let me retract what I said about exactly. But to get them to march in some common way is probably not necessary. And if you try to impose it, you cut down on the creativity inside the tent. What I do hope is happening is that you'll see, again, inside the tent, you'll see things happening at boundaries that maybe you didn't anticipate. The one thing that came to mind when Jim was asking was this new area of what's now called organizational economics. The economics department now has a field in that area, but I can point to places inside finance where we're trying to open up the black box of the corporation and understand how finance works inside of it. That would be an example of an area where it's going to be cross boundaries. And I actually think that's going to develop very rapidly. But it's not something somebody planned. You see what I mean?
Just as another comment, first of all, I think my experience with the senior executive programs, one of the things it did was it allowed me a sort of a language to speak cross disciplines much more. And I think that that's something that's valuable for people in individual disciplines. But I suspect that the way to get much broader knowledge is basically the way Nitin had his PhD committee. It's sort of the wisdom of crowds. But it helps a lot if the crowds can talk to each other.
There is a backbone, not in the PhD committee, but I want to come back to this. Basically, all of our, we are forced to cooperate on all of our teaching programs. The only one that is more decentralized, and I'd say more decentralized, we still cooperate, is at the PhD level. And I think that my view on this, and again, I'm a relative newcomer, I'm only here 11 years, right? My view on this is that it is because of that engagement with people, as what Lottie calls the phenomena, right? To go and talk to people in companies about how they're viewing things, that you actually start to move beyond the silos, and you start actually to generate those kinds of boundary work that Stu was talking about. At least that's my experience. Now, I'm not done drinking all the Kool-Aid from MIT. I'm only here 11 years. Please, Joanne.
If I could just add, Vonda, I think, is a very good. Vonda is a very good example of how this works at the interstices, where she's crossing not only two groups, but two areas. And I think the story Nitin told about what ended up being his committee is another fabulous example. So even if we don't have, a single unified theory, what we have is a great ability to work across the boundaries, and those boundaries are often where the most exciting things emerge and bubble up. So I think you see it on this panel.
Please, Gordy.
An elegant, nimble summary of our history in this domain. Can the panel speculate on two things? First, do you expect the current model to survive for, say, 10 years, 15 or 20 years? And if not, what is going to replace it?
You mean the model of our PhD program?
Yeah, the model of the PhD program.
Okay.
Another way of parsing that is to say, can you speculate on major turning points in each of the functional silos that will induce a change in our internal organizational behavior and how we treat learning at the PhD level?
I'll make one suggestion of an idea that I think people are ready for, that won't change the fundamentals of the PhD program, but could change fundamentals of PhD teaching around the US, and that is to have joint seminars that cross several universities. because one of the problems, especially in business schools, is that the cohorts are too small. And the idea of having courses and seminars across universities would be to create both a sharing of intellectual ideas, economies of scale, intellectual vitality. And I think the technology is getting to the point where people can start thinking about it seriously.
Can I try, even though I think that you're absolutely right. One opportunity that, to me, is an extraordinary opportunity that lies is to leverage. I mean, there's no reason why we should have such distinct MIT PhD programs and Harvard OB PhD or Harvard PhD programs or BUP. I mean, just think about Boston. That if we could find some way of doing more to leverage all of the capability that exists in this. And I had the great fortune, in fact, I discovered Harvard Business School because I went to a seminar that was given by Paul Lawrence in his basement in his house because he couldn't find any other institutional way of doing it. So this just ended up being a pure off the back of, it was not a registered course, it was just something that he did because there was demand from some of us at MIT, there was demand from some people that he had at Harvard, and there was no formal way in which he could do it. So he just said, you know, enough of that, I just care about PhD students. I'm just going to have this seminar in the evening, 6 to 8. He used to offer us pizza. And 14 of us came, and we ended up, many of us have become lifelong friends. So there's a very special opportunity, and we see a little bit more of that happening as we speak today, but I don't think that enough of that happens. So that's one thing. The other thing which I think is, so this is an opportunity, a threat that I think we have to be very careful about, is that I worry that the confidence that people have in PhDs that get formed in business schools, as opposed to PhDs that come from just economics departments or sociology departments or psychology departments, there's almost, if we aren't careful, a preference developing to get the pure discipline-based PhD into business schools, as opposed to feeling confident about the PhD students that come from management programs. And if we continue to allow that drift to occur in that direction, I'm not sure it's a good drift for the future of PhD programs like this or ours.
I really liked your question, and 15 years down the road, I hadn't thought about it this way. We're 385 parts per million CO2 in the environment now, rising about, is that about right? 392. Gosh, I haven't looked recently.
That was last month.
So that gorilla sits right on my shoulder. 15 years, I don't know we have 15 years before there's just massive changes in the world. And I had a feeling that as wonderful as it is to train deep scholars who in their silos make real fundamental contributions to other scholars in their silos, if there's going to be a pressure on Harvard and MIT and others to train deeply intellectual people to find ways to deal with the problems we have now, and that maybe scholarship will change much more to the old days of MIT when it was, I was here, was committed to bringing about change and action. And that maybe the use of intellectual power, the people that come into MIT and Harvard and Chicago and others, is best focused much more deeply, much more solidly on how do we deal with 2 billion people who are living $1 a day. And that maybe we take a little aside from the 28th footnote of Modigliani and Miller in the 23rd article on that, and that we have a chance in some of these institutions to deal with the problems that the world has in a much more active way, and we can get a little bit, go back to our really deep scholarship once we solve that problem. So I don't know if we have 15 years, but I think we've really got to start, and this is the undergraduate and the graduates here at MIT are doing great stuff. I hear BU is doing great stuff, and I know some good stuff's going at Harvard. But maybe our PhD program is, the way we're doing it, is a luxury that's no longer appropriate for our society, the way we're doing it. And we can go back to that once we have a chance for our children and grandchildren to have a place to live. And that's the problem that I think we really need to be focusing on.
Can I?
Please.
Yeah. Just a quick response that I do agree, but I don't think they're as mutually exclusive as perhaps you've painted it. I mean, if you took a look at the kinds of doctoral dissertations that are being done right now, not only at Sloan but across MIT, I would think you will see deep engagement with exactly those issues. I mean, John's, pioneering real deep doctoral work in system dynamics for sustainability issues. I think you're seeing that with our energy initiative. I think you're seeing that in organizational studies and economic sociology, where they are looking deeply at systemic change. So yes, not across the board, but I think you are seeing it already, and I think that will continue. But I do agree with you that the thing that might even push us to change even more is fundamental change in the world outside that is going to ask us to break down some of those boundaries. But I think that is already happening. I don't think those are, the deep engagement with the ideas is not inconsistent with the deep engagement with the world, and I think we're already seeing that in our doctoral work.
I'll second that as well. I mean, it's doctoral students want to have an impact on the world, and so they will see how they can use their education to have the impact. In addition, if you look at tenure process, people don't really get tenure based on having great footnotes. They get tenure based on impact on the world and on their research community.
So we are over time. I want to once again thank the panel for their thoughtful comments, and please, our guest as well. Join me.